Welcome to week 4 of Votewatch24. I'm Peter Jukes, Executive Editor of Byline Times. And our subject this week, well, I'm joined by Hardeep and Adam. What are the odds? The bets are obviously on. Yes, you know what we're going to be talking about this Friday evening, and that is 4 people investigated, 1 apparently arrested, for betting on the timing of the general election with insider information. We'll be talking to Adam, our political editor, about that, and I'll be talking to Hardeep, our editor, about the role of betting and an even deeper role, which we've been investigating for 5 years now, haven't we, Hardeep, of hedge funds and people cashing in on market-making decisions. We'll also be looking at last night's debate with Rishi Sunak, a bit petulant, wouldn't you say, Adam?
Yeah, he's looking more and more miserable every time he does one of these events.
And maybe Keir Starmer looking slightly more warmed up and friendly and accessible. And we'll also be talking about who other than our favourite subject, Reform UK. Reform used to be their previous abbreviated title, by the way. I'm not being rude. And Nigel Farage. I had 5 questions to ask him about Brexit, Trump and Russia, and we might go over those and his recent manoeuvres. But first, Adam, headline on this week's digital edition is Spivocracy. I think you've come up with this title. Tell me about Spivocracy and what happened this week. The news scandal. It doesn't take a week. There's always a news scandal for Rishi Sunak.
Well, yes, I mean, you'd think by this stage of the election that things would have calmed down and the scandals would have run out. But no, another week, another scandal affecting Rishi Sunak. Quite directly, this news that his senior advisors, senior Conservative officials and Conservative candidates all bet on the date of the general election, and data suggesting that lots of those bets took place immediately before Rishi Sunak announced the date of the general election. There's now an investigation by the Gambling Commission, and a protection officer has been arrested as well. And this sort of taps into a sort of broader sense, I think, that has developed over the past 14 years, that the Conservative Party and this government has been governing sort of largely in their own interests rather than the interests of the country.
So we just go dig down a little bit detail?
Yes.
There's some people, our international audience, there might be people who haven't quite followed this story in detail. So there were 3 investigations by the Gambling Commission over the fact that senior aides or people in a position to know put money on the betting market, saying, because you can spread bet on anything, you probably spread bet how late we'll be with this show, on some gambling market with insider knowledge. And that is in breach of some gambling rules, is it?
Gambling rules, yes. It's unclear whether, with the exception of the police protection officer, whether there's actually any criminal investigation going in, but there's certainly the potential breach of the rules and the gambling. So it's not clear exactly how far this will go, but it does involve the PPS to the Prime Minister, who's senior parliamentary aide, the director of the Conservative Party campaign, who's now been suspended,
and his wife,
who's also worked for the Conservative Party as well.
So
who's also a candidate.
And also a candidate. So these people in a position to know went and put some money, maybe not huge amounts of money, but we have seen graphs. There was a spike, wasn't there, on Betfair?
Yeah, so we don't know because virtually none of the betting companies publish this information, but one does, Betfair Exchange, publish this information.
Because that's a Betfair against
other
betting.
They don't publish it, they make it available.
Yes.
It's possible to scrape it from their website. And this shows that in the days leading up to the announcement, and particularly the day before the announcement, there was this surge of betting activity. It is, from what we can see, at least on this one site, we're talking about thousands of pounds that were bet, not massive amounts.
But this is only one.
This is only one site, and we don't know sort of how many sites and how many people were involved in this.
But there were quite a lot of bets, a lot of small bets, but a lot of them, right? So it's a big spike. We can't see the graph here, but if you were to see it, it's tiddling along like that and then goes like that. It's a very noticeable spike. So this is privileged information a small group of people would have known, which seems to spread out, at least, and in one market led to a spike. So would that suggest, Adam, and what's your information, is as our expert who has his ear to the ground in Whitehall, if you can have your ear to the ground in Whitehall, this suggests there's more than just maybe four people.
So there are reports and rumours that this involves more individuals. There was one rumour doing the rounds that it actually involves a cabinet minister.
Gosh.
This was put to Rishi Sunak today at a press conference, and he chose not to answer that point, to deny or to confirm that fact. So, but that is certainly doing the rounds that it does involve a cabinet minister, which would be an extraordinary development if that's the case.
Well, it's already involved the partner, a candidate who's the wife of the campaign manager who's had to be suspended. So that's pretty bad. So situations like this, Adam, and it reminds me slightly of Partygate and crony contracts. This is a hue and cry now. Every journalist is going to be trying to track down who that other person was. This is not going to end quickly, is it?
No, I mean, the really remarkable fact about this is that you would have expected the Prime Minister himself to have moved immediately and to have disassociated his party from these individuals. The Prime Minister today repeatedly insisting that he's going to wait for the result of the Gambling Commission investigation. But, there's only one person who knows for certain who knew this information. He took the decision to call the election. He knows who was aware of it. He works very closely with all of these individuals. He could work this out himself without any investigation very quickly. And
he hasn't suspended anybody. So the police officer, obviously it's a slightly different order of public conduct, isn't it? We're not prejudicing what's in the investigation, but this is a person who has a clear duty of conduct. We've seen in past investigations like Partygate, let's not forget that Rishi Sunak himself got a penalty notice as well as Boris Johnson. These people investigate themselves, they hold themselves to a slightly lower threshold than you would a police officer.
Well, I think there's a difference here. The law on this is unclear. It's unclear if there's going to be any sort of criminal charges at all, aside from potentially the police protection officer. But there's clearly an ethical dimension to this. And it does tap into that broader sense that I think we saw also with Partygate, where the people, there's a sense that the people in power don't follow a different set of rules to everybody else. And I think that's ultimately what it plays into. But in terms of finance, yes, I think it's likely to not be huge amounts of money. But I think as I've written today, it taps into this broader sense that those at the top of power have, and their donors and the PPE scandal, et cetera, there's just this record of the government sort of serving their own interests, including their own financial interests, rather than the interests of the country itself.
Well, we'll get later to the larger amounts of money in hedge funds and things like that. Let's just dig down a bit on this particular issue, because Rishi Sunak himself, we'll go to the fact that he made millions as a hedge fund.
Well, he is a former hedge funder himself, yes.
Yeah, out of the disaster of the 2008 crash. But this, I think the analogy most salient in people's minds is going to be Partygate, isn't it? While, the Queen was mourning alone the death of Prince Philip, while we were, I miss birthday parties, miss my son's birthday party, people miss funerals, they were having a wild time. Hundreds of penalty notice, including, as I noticed, the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak, and then Boris Johnson. So yeah, that isn't that everybody understands a flutter, everybody bets on the Grand National, but obviously also understands a rigged bet when you're betting with that horse is going to win. So you think this just opens up this sort of attitude?
Yes, and I think particularly when it's still unclear why the Prime Minister called the general election when he did. So there's always this sense that he called this election for his own political advantage rather than for, so much of his agenda hasn't been able to be pushed through. Like smoking ban, for instance, wasn't given time.
Rwanda flights.
Yeah, Rwanda flights. So it does tap into that sort of broader sense that this was for their own interests, political interests, but also in this case, the financial interests of those who sought to benefit from this announcement.
I mean, somebody did post there was a Conservative attack ad showing Keir Starmer and Kim Jong-il and somebody else and Putin looking at him, going, "Oh, he's an easy mark." Of course, then somebody retweeted the fact that. Is only his father-in-law, not his father, but his wife's father meeting with Putin. So we know that Infosys that company has had contracts.
Well, the Conservative campaign adverts have generally been incredibly badly timed. In the hours before this scandal broke, and even after it broke, the Conservative Party's Twitter account had launched a video showing a roulette wheel, trying to say don't risk yourself with Labour. That advert has now since been deleted by the party for obvious reasons.
Yeah, there's that expression, isn't it? Casino capitalism, and that sort of speaks to that a bit. Hardeep, just What did you make of this? We'll talk about the deeper structural issues going back to Brexit with hedge funds and all that. But what did you make of and last night's performance of Rishi Sunak when he said it's awful, that's never happened, and then never said he's going to do anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Adam. It just feeds into this notion of it's one rule for us, another for everybody else. And I think it's really bad news because it cuts through, as we say, with the public. Everyone understands what a bet is. It's just relatable. So it's a story that the BBC or the broadcasters have all gone with for once. And
have
so
they really? I haven't been checking.
Yeah.
It's
So
been
I
bleeding away.
think it is really bad news because it's another message to the public, as Adam says, that there are personal, private interests that are so far removed from what the public cares about. Or deserves of its politicians, and the fact that it's sort of placing bets. Yeah. There's something about it. It's so sort of base in terms of politics, and I think it's really damaging because it just continues to erode this notion of what our representative democracy is. It's really corrosive because it's another scandal where people, are sitting there and thinking these people are just in it for themselves. They really are. And what I find curious is, as you say, it's not huge amounts of money. So presumably these bets are not coming in sort of tens and tens of thousands of pounds for people. Which is what I think is even more interesting about this the potential psychology of the intent behind this.
Yeah.
I mean, is it just that a group of people feel empowered, know that there's a lot of impunity baked into the British political system and the media, and they just thought, you know what, we're probably going to lose the election. Let's have a little bit of a flutter as on our way out. Just because we can, no one's going to find out. Nothing's going to happen to us. Sunak's going to protect us because this is what is at the heart of it. This is the thread that runs through everything. And so in that way, it's like the ultimate symbol of, it's even just a little bet. And they're just like, yeah, let's do that. It's disgraceful.
I think you're absolutely right about that. It does tap into the kind of ethics, but even if you leave the morality of this aside, what does it say about the people at the top of the Conservative Party that they would be so stupid as to lay these bets in their own name, knowing full well that these checks would be made, and to think they could get away? I think it makes them look, as well as immoral, makes them look incompetent, and that's in some ways an even bigger risk, I think, for Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, I mean, but I think Hardeep's point is so well made. And you did see this also with Partygate because there was hundreds of penalty notices. So we know that at least Johnson and Sunak had unlawful gatherings when we were all locked down. But then everybody starts it. It's this contagious, isn't it? It's that sense that they all do it. Now,
and the arrogance of doing it as well.
Yeah, that the key thing is you'll get away with it. Nobody will check. It's become kind of the modus operandi of the. We can talk about why that's become the modus operandi. Maybe it'd be worth looking now at the crony contract, the VIP lane. For people who don't know, there was, as we first exposed on Byline Times for 2 years, really, before the National Audit Office reported, there were hundreds of these contracts for companies that had no employees or been lifestyle, never existed before, had been focused on lifestyle products for coronavirus contracts, particularly for PPE, but sometimes for testing. Immediately when the pandemic struck in early 2020, our first report was in April by Nafiz Ahmed. And the sense was that here's everybody else suffering, yet, and we know, the case of Michelle Mone, Baroness Mone, and there's 200 million, they're being investigated by the NCA. But, there are 16 billion pounds worth of contracts, of which at least half of them were useless. So that's public money. That's a lot of public money going through, not exclusively, but mainly through a VIP lane. And that's actually, I think, the government's own terms for it when Jolyon Morn, Good Law Project, got them to disclose on that. The thing about a bet like this, Adam, isn't it? It's always against somebody else's expense. You only make money when everybody else is betting the other way.
Yeah, it distorts the market. So other people laying bets honestly, just off their own hunch or whatever, are missing out and getting different odds because of the surge of bets that took place that day.
Yeah, and because you have inside information, you're basically taking money off the people who haven't got the inside information. Yeah. And certainly with the PPE contracts, wasn't it? This is taking money. You happen to be in a position where you have a contact in China or potentially a contact in China. And you get, and that, we always talk about the 1% dominating politics as the 1% who own whatever it is now, 95% of the wealth. But we always understood they were kind of a vested interest to pressure politics. We didn't understand quite until this closing moment that this has become the operating principle of the Conservative Party at lower and higher ranks. I mean, we've got, maybe you could talk briefly about, we have three people on the digital front page. We have Truss, and we have Sunak, and we have Cameron, who, what did he do when he left Parliament? When he left number 10 after the Brexit?
Yes, I mean, you look at this, this goes well beyond Rishi Sunak. You look at the people around at the top level of the Conservative Party and the government. David Cameron, who left office and then became involved in a massive lobbying scandal involving his former colleagues in government. You might have suspected that would be the end of his political career. Not a bit of it. He was welcomed back into the party. Somebody like Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, who first rose to public prominence for using fake names in order to run a get-rich-quick scheme. Again, you might have suspected that would be the end of his political career. Not a bit of it. He's gone from strength to strength since then. Boris Johnson, who left office, ignored the regulations on taking post-government appointments, took a job with a hedge fund. Yes, back to hedge funds again. Met with the Venezuelan president despite advice to the country on behalf of a hedge fund. And the list goes on and on and on. Of course, Liz Truss as well. Her chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, also a former hedge funder, used to work for Crispin Odey.
More about him later.
More about him later. And on the day that he announced his so-called mini budget, which destroyed the mortgages and hopes of millions of people around the country, he met with senior hedge funders who egged him on to carry on with his disastrous measures. So there was just this, at every level, particularly at the top, there was just this. It seems like every single senior figure has got some kind of personal interest in this world that we're talking about, which is on a much larger scale than anything revealed during this scandal of sort of junior officials and candidates making bets.
Spivocracy, I think, is a good word for it. It's your coinage.
I also think it speaks to something that is that we've really seen in these past few years in politics, which is what are people actually the public has a valid point when it says, what are these people actually in it for? Yeah. We have to be careful that that's not just something we see as a sort of trope that the public has in its mind and they're all the same, why they actually, that's a valid point. As you've just said, Adam, several people very high up in the Conservative Party, the question does arise, what are they in it for? And I remember speaking to the Labour peer, Lord Alf Dubs, earlier this year, and he, very long career in politics, was an MP, peer.
An amazing origin story. Exactly.
And done a lot of work around refugees. And when he sums up sort of his political life, he said, you've got to believe in something. And for me, all of this is the impression you get is, what do these people believe in? What do they actually believe in? And the problem with Rishi Sunak, and I saw this in the debate again last night, it's very hard to pinpoint, who is he as a political figure? What does he believe in? What is he motivated by? Beyond this notion of the Rwanda scheme and national service, these kind of sort of gimmicks, who is he? And where has he come from? How has that been formed? And who is Liz Truss? And what did David Cameron really believe in? And what about Kwasi Kwarteng? Why is he going to those champagne lunches and then crashing the pound? What is it that motivates any of these people? What do they believe in? And I think in some ways, the biggest trajectory of the Conservative Party has been that, because, and Lord Alf Dubs also said that he vehemently disagreed with Margaret Thatcher, but he really respected her as a politician because she believed in something, for example.
She wasn't in it for the money. You'd never say that.
Yeah, we've just gone very much the other way. And this constant focus on financial gain or sort of just personal ideology. You could argue Cameron and George Osborne, very, very set on austerity, was never really clear to the public why, and it wasn't really challenged by the media. All these different things. What is actually motivating these people? And I think for me, that's one of the biggest questions that's really emerged.
I think you could really see that in Boris Johnson's tenure. So much of the commentary and debate was about, can he afford to remain Prime Minister? Can he afford to stand again as Prime Minister. And of course, all of the stories about loans being arranged for him through the chairman of the BBC and the sort of borrowing money to decorate Downing Street.
We forgot about the BBC chairman,
Yes.
Adam. Oh
Yes.
my God, that happened as well. The,
Oh, yeah.
the
Got
BBC's
knighted. Yes.
chairman was arranging the loan.
And got
Oh
knighted
my
this
God.
week.
I
Richard Sharp.
don't think he did. He missed out. Richard Sharp.
I think he was
Because of
I think he
that.
was recommended, but
But
I think
he was- yeah.
Sorry, well, I missed
No,
that so much.
clearly
Yeah.
he was recommended.
Yeah.
But
But
it's
no.
interesting. We will come back, as I said, to Rishi Sunak hedge funds because there's a bigger story about oligarchy and disaster capitalism. But just it's interesting. Last night I watched the debates, as you both watched the debates, did you? Yes. So I was in and out. But one of the things I think that Starmer seemed to be saying was this notion of bringing back the idea, not of national service, of public service.
Yes. No, he's repeatedly made that point. He wants to restore public service, and he is a former public servant. Head of the DPP. We'll see if he lives up to that record, but it's certainly, I think, something that chimes with the public. The sense that the politicians are not in it shouldn't be in it for themselves. They should be in for sort of serving the public, and we'll see how he does with that.
And not a Grant Shapps. And even Jeremy Hunt, who in this current cabinet seems like the grown-up sometimes, like a man of great stature. I mean, he made his money in sort of educational software. It's very much this sort of, there's a great phrase from the French, the sort of the Second Empire, I think it was, but it was most bourgeois, and it was enrichez-vous, go and enrich yourselves, which seems to be the more.
Well, this is common. I mean, I often see commentators say about wealthy politicians that because of their wealth, they're sort of inoculated from corruption, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. Actually, that's often said about Rishi Sunak. He's got so much money that he doesn't.
That's right.
I'm not suggesting Rishi Sunak is personally corrupt, but you see with a lot of these politicians, Boris Johnson's a very wealthy man. It certainly didn't stop him from seeking undisclosed loans and all the rest of it. But I think that's something of a myth that actually people with money don't then try to seek it out. But actually, sometimes the opposite is the case because you have that you're motivated by those factors.
Oh,
more
one
than others.
of our theories of this way back at the beginning of Byline Times, and you're right. Like Michael Heseltine was wealthy. He rang the Haymarket Publishing Group, may still do. Margaret Thatcher was married to a millionaire. Now, millionaire isn't what it is today as it was then. But it is the ethos, the expectation. And so let's go back maybe a little bit on this hedge fund issue, Hardeep, because I went to see Jonathan Pye at his one-man show recently. And he it's really the story of the Conservative government. And his big starts in 2008, basically, with the crash. And then ends up, and now we've got the ultimate prime minister, a guy who made his millions in the crash, a hedge fund prime minister. And there is that sense that we had ever since 2008, what they call socialism for the rich, that the people who lost millions in the banking crisis lost billions, trillions actually, were bailed out to the tune of trillions. You had quantitative easing, but one person is imprisoned, I think, for all this millions lost. And somebody like Rishi Sunak made money out of it because basically the state stepped in, became the lender of the last resort, and bailed out capitalism. So this seems to be what's happened in the last, 16 years. And to the Conservative Party, I've always said this, if you're a businessman in 2008 and you saw what happened to all those people blowing up, the moral hazard, it's called the moral hazard, the fact the state bailed them out, you'd go, well, the state has all this money. Let's go and work in the state. Let's get those state contracts. Let's get those state funds. And so Rishi Sunak makes his money in 2008. I think it's 5 million, and then works for Goldman Sachs under Richard Sharp, who's a good friend, apparently. And then what happens, we detected in 2016 with Brexit, isn't it? And we did our first piece on this 2019, is this idea of disaster capitalism. When something goes really wrong, when the pound crashes, people can make money. Now, we followed three big hedge funders, wasn't it? Crispin Robin Odey, who's Rupert Murdoch's ex-son-in-law. And he made he funded both Vote Leave to quite a large amount of money, millions, I think, and Leave EU, both Farage's and the official Boris Johnson one, and made 250 the night of the Brexit. He put all his money in gold, gold shot through the roof because the pound crashed and he made 250 million. Another guy is Paul Marshall with his partner Waste Marshall made 350 million. Paul Marshall funded Vote Leave. He, apparently, according to Tim Shipman, he's the one who persuaded Gove to go for Brexit. So we have £500 million made overnight by two hedge funds. Paul Marshall now, as we know, big donor. He basically funds GB News and Unheard. And then what happened, Hardeep? Because we started covering this crony capitalism. And Chris Robin O'Leary, finally, for those who don't know, he incubated Jacob Rees-Mogg's fund, which isn't quite a hedge fund, Somerset Capital. And Jacob Rees-Mogg now says he has nothing to do with. So you have this sense that all these people making money out of disasters, the cost of the country, they cashed in. So we started covering this, didn't we, in 2019? And sorry, this is going on a bit. And we revealed that there was a apparent spike. There was definitely a spike of shorting, maybe not the frequency one of our graphs showed, around the hard Brexit date of then set for October 2019. And we got a lot of criticism of that. This surely isn't happening. All the rest of the media sneered at us. We got a lot of grief. But then Philip Hammond, I think, said there was probably the hard Brexit would be good for hedge funders.
Well, I think the way in which our coverage was interpreted was that we were saying there's a direct causation between, between the two things, and that hedge funds were directly making money off of these things, and it was all sort of in cahoots. And we were saying no, because it is hedge funds, their job is to do that. It's to look and hedge and look at the risk and the bets. So they're just doing what's lawful. But what we were trying to raise was the wider point about the influence, the potential influence of hedge funds, those organizations, that world of finance within politics. That's what we were actually trying to raise. And I think that that wasn't what was picked up on. Everyone was saying, Byline Times is suggesting that the date of the hard Brexit was only because so these people could make money. We were saying something more nuanced, which is underneath, on a structural level, if you've got people in positions of power like Boris Johnson, who have a lot of people funding them in their own interests from that world, then could that have some sort of impact on the decision-making of that politician? That's what we were saying. And I think, there was a backlash, especially from the established press, the Financial Times, the Independent, all sorts of people. And I think it was all kind of borne out when in 2022, we had this mini budget from Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. And as Adam alluded to earlier, there was a story in the Times that emerged that later that same day after the budget was delivered, Kwasi Kwarteng enjoyed a champagne reception with many individuals associated with hedge funds, city finances, who were all sort of calling him a useful idiot behind his back, according to the Times. And he delivered what was going to be helpful for them. And then everyone woke up and thought, this is really bad, that you could potentially have this influence going on, which is what we were trying to highlight from the beginning.
And also the thing was, when you basically hedge funds bet they do go long and short, so they sort of spread against the market. If this go down, you could buy a bet basically going down and make money, and some going up. It's not exclusive shorting. There was insider knowledge though about the hard Brexit date. So the problem is that, for example, what happened with Odey, there is no such thing as insider trading over foreign currencies. So there's a market abuse rule that you shouldn't use. But the problem is to what extent the politicians are pressured. They're conflicted because they're rich pals who fund their parties and their campaigns. Have a lifestyle, have a sort of way of being that they could enjoy. Boris Johnson went to speak to them. Now, what happened?
Then there's just very quickly, there's like a parallel here of an example of the same applies, because it's a level of influence which is almost unconscious. Yeah. So, for example, if you have very prominent political editors of the BBC who have a sort of social relationship with the politicians that it's their job to hold to account, it is what is the journalist influenced by unconsciously in their own heads as to how they're then conducting that scrutiny of those people, right? It's the same thing.
Well, and Boris Johnson mixing with people who have £40,000 rolls of wallpaper, that's expect the norm. Just back to that summer. So we ran that story about apparently a lot of shorting going around, a lot of trading going around that date of 31st of October. Obviously, that didn't happen because what happened was the attempt to prorogate, Parliament prorogation, was stopped by the Supreme Court. We didn't have a hard Brexit. There's a slightly less hard Brexit in the January. But in a documentary which was recorded around the time Boris Johnson was going for the leadership, this is mid-August, and they were talking about doing a hard Brexit and prorogate. Chris Binodi is interviewed. He knows about it already. He knows Parliament's going to be prorogued. So there's the danger, isn't it? Now, obviously, I'm not saying he did bet on that, it didn't work because you're taking a risk. But this idea that disaster capitalism, you're circulating around these people. And just on that thought, the fascinating thing that came out of studying the financiers who donated to Vote Leave EU and to Johnson, 75% of them came by hedge funds or city traders. Now, when I looked it up, 4% of the UK's economy is finance. Most of that's retail banking. Only a fraction of that is hedge funds. So like 0.5% of the population was 75% of the donors. I think that speaks to your same thing about the journalists, isn't it? We're in a bubble where the media gets to meet Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak like 10 times more than doctors or unions, definitely, but construction or maybe not JCB or something like general bankers or something car industry.
I think it's worth saying that there's clearly this close relationship between hedge funds and the Conservative Party. Hedge funds donating millions of pounds to the Conservative Party over the last 14 years. It does appear that's starting to shift now. There's an excellent piece by Peter Gagan today looking at the latest Electoral Commission donation records. Labour Party took 15 times more donations than the Conservative Party in the last week. Some of that came from big donors they've had in the past, like Sainsbury, Lubna as well, the Auto Glass executive. But also a large amount came from a leading hedge funder as well.
Are they named?
I can't recall. It's not somebody I've recognised before, but it's I think it was hundreds of thousands of pounds from a leading hedge fund executive.
Right.
So it does seem like this is not something that's going to go away just because we've got a change of government. There's been a lot of money invested in politics by this industry, and I don't think that's going to change too much.
And Byline Times will be keeping an eye on it and making sure that this government, new government, whatever it is, isn't being pushed forward by these forces who can, not always. Hedge funds, can do good things. The idea of hedge funds is they smooth over, fluctuations in the market. If you can sell, goes back to the corn exchanges in Chicago, that you basically sell your wheat ahead at this price, like $50. And if it's actually everybody else is selling more, you lose out, and your trader, you lose out. But the trader makes a lot of money, but maybe it sells at less and the trader loses out and you keep more money. So there is a role for it, but if it's not dominant, certainly this needs to be stopped. We need to have maybe an investigation, but the market abuse regulation, only used once, should be more enforced, because I think hopefully this scandal of the betting will alert more people's eyes.
And of course, another big political figure who knows this world very well is Nigel Farage as well, who had questions himself about shorting the pound during the 2016 EU referendum night, I'm sure.
But there's a famous picture, isn't there, Adam? Maybe describe it to us for viewers who haven't seen it.
It's him pointing to a TV screen of the pound's value going down and sort of, thumbs up.
That thumbs up, it goes down, thumbs up. That exactly, yes. It's hurting us, but it's benefiting him.
But it's interesting, that story, because what it revealed is that there's normally an exit poll at a general election. There wasn't an exit poll, I think. There was an exit poll. There wasn't like a formal exit poll of for the EU referendum. But a lot of these hedge funds paid for their own private these hedge funds paid for their own private exit polls, and it's under law, it's illegal to publish these while polls are still open. But lots of people in that world had access to them, and one of the people who had access to them is Nigel Farage himself. And so he had seen these exit polls showing that Leave were going to win.
Really? I
Yes.
didn't know that.
And
What happens at 10
and
o'clock?
yet, what happened at 10 o'clock is he went onto the television and effectively conceded to Remain.
And then the pound shot
And
up.
then the pound shot up. And lots of hedge funds made lots of money in that window from shorting the value of the pound. A report by Bloomberg a couple of years later strongly suggested that this was a deliberate attempt to short the pound, and questions were put to Nigel Farage about that. He admitted having early access to that, but said that he'd made his own judgment that Remain were going to win, and he denied that he had personally benefited financially from this shorting of the pound. But it's certainly a very murky world, I think.
And it shows the possibilities there for others to benefit. And obviously, I think going back to our point, firstly, the lack of regulation on this. I mean, I think in America, the SEC would be knocking on your door quite quickly. We have quite light touch regulation, thanks to Blair and Brown. And I think also to this impunity, Hardeep. And let's turn to another subject. We will get back to Farage in the last bit of the program. And part of that impunity has been thanks to the press, hasn't it? I mean, because we were alone for a long time looking at PPE. Other people caught up, some great journalism, really good journalism sources, some people like David Connett at The Guardian. We were quite alone in other subjects. But then, especially like the bungs alleged to give to the press for COVID advertisements. But then, the other media caught up things like Partygate, and obviously with some help from Dominic Cummings. But often it's too late. And obviously, looking at the betting scandal, the ethos is generally you can get away with it because the press lets you.
Unfortunately, I think that is a big reason why we've seen the levels of impunity, which have just escalated and escalated. I honestly think the people who've been betting on the election date saw it as a last hurrah. They're going to lose the election anyway. And what's really going to happen to us? What's really going to happen to us? And it is both incompetent and staggering levels of arrogance. But there is some truth to the fact that what is going to happen to them? And that is a big, big problem as to why we're in the state we are now. Because we've had, as Brian Cathcart's always given in his analysis for Byline Times, that merger between the media and political class. You don't have a media that sufficiently sits outside of that system and can scrutinize it, hold it to account. It's part of the same system, in effect. And I think that's the reason why every single time something happened that required the scrutiny, and it wasn't the case that was applied, you got the next thing and the next thing. And I think it's been said before, but most prominently that Brexit campaign, the misleading statements, lies that were told, I think because that was it was normalized, that led to Partygate and everything else, and Boris Johnson as a prime minister who could mislead Parliament, and so
because our mates in the press will look after us.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a narrative at the moment I'm hearing that whether the newspapers, the tabloids are going to endorse Keir Starmer or the Labour Party, and this notion that doesn't really matter anymore. And to some extent, I think there is something in that. They don't seem to have the same grip on power as they did, and Keir Starmer will have his own approach and may not need to be dependent on it because he'll have quite a big majority, it seems. But I don't think that means on 5th of July, suddenly the influence of the right-wing press is not going to be of any relevance. I don't think that's the case. Because what we've always been trying to say is it's not so much about the Sun newspaper anymore trying to realistically influence the public. They're always it's always the pressure points between the politicians and how much trouble the tabloids going to create for them or not. Yeah. And I do think that dynamic is going to be much harder to dismantle. I don't know if you've got a sense of that, Adam, and why that might be.
Well, I think on a sort of related story, I think we're going to come on to talk about this, about Will Lewis and the Washington
Yes, we're going to get to that.
Post. But there's a story this week that he had advised Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister to, actually, I think it was after he was Prime Minister, or potentially, I can't remember.
I think it's the Save Big Dog campaign.
Yes, so at the end of his premiership, that's right. So at the end of his premiership, advised him and senior officials in government to delete difficult WhatsApps that could come up in the COVID inquiry.
Which they did.
Now, Boris Johnson has denied doing this. However, there were 5,000 WhatsApp messages that were missing from his phone when he handed it over to the COVID inquiry. Now, this, at the time, I thought was absolutely remarkable because this is actually a criminal offence a potential criminal offence under the Inquiries Act to deliberately destroy evidence that is required by a public inquiry.
Rishi Sunak lost a lot of messages.
Rishi Sunak lost a lot of messages as well. Why was this never investigated? Why was there never a police inquiry? Why was this not splashed across the front pages of all of the newspapers?
Well,
and when you compare that to how this current scandal, the election betting scandal, is being covered, where the BBC, which has had, as we've reported before, has kind of had a sort of unspoken sort of rule of not reporting big political scandals over recent years because of fear of losing access to government, has been all over this story right at the time when the Conservative Party are about to lose office, and lots of the papers have been all over this story as well. And it does feel like had this story happened a couple of years ago, when the Conservative Party looked like they were still going to be in office for some years to come, it would not have been treated in the way that we're currently seeing it treated, as they're all but certain to leave office.
Well, so there is that pack mentality. They no longer can do you any favours. You might as well kick them in the down. Will Lewis, let's just talk a little bit to explain to the audience about Will Lewis, who may not know about him, because this very, very interesting and powerful character, and quite instrumental, it's now clear, in Boris Johnson's career, which we've only just really realised. I've came across him because of the phone hacking saga. He was head of the Management Services Committee, moved from the Telegraph, who's supposed to be helping the police and the legal cases with phone hacking. What emerged in the trial, from sometimes from my tweets and then from further civil cases, is that virtually every point when the police and civil litigants told the Management Services Committee, run by Will Lewis, to preserve evidence and emails, they deleted them. So this is why the story of him getting Boris Johnson to delete his WhatsApps is particularly salient. There were 200 emails he ordered deleted. There were 20 million emails he ordered deleted. Because of the cleverness of some of the backups he didn't realize, about 11 million were recovered, and that's part of the reason the trial went ahead. But he then went on to work for Murdoch as the publisher of the Wall Street Journal, and then recently has arrived in as head of the Washington Post, brought up by Jeff Bezos to the other great rival to the New York Times, bigger than Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. So here's an amazing story. I just imagine you want to conceive this. Could you ever imagine, ask you first, Adam, that the BBC have this big scandal in their cupboard, maybe something like Jimmy Savile, and the first thing they do is investigate, while he's still alive, publish a program about Jimmy Savile. Can you imagine that?
Well, it didn't happen, yes. I mean, they have investigated themselves sort of post-fact on something. So I think BBC is probably the only organisation that does sometimes.
It did eventually publish,
yes,
you're right,
yeah.
But it was only after they stopped it.
Yes, yeah.
Marion Jones and then ITV did a documentary. Hardeep, phone hackings. I imagine there's a blagger in this, a scandal in the Sunday Times. One of the employees who we've talked to and got a dossier on 6 years ago, turns out for 10 years has been illicitly gaining material by pretending to be other people, getting bank details. Can you imagine the Sunday Times splashing with that on their front page?
No, I mean, that's the entire problem. So this very interesting story about the Washington Post, the reporters and the teams there have been up in arms about these British journalists taking these prominent positions. So Will Lewis, I believe, is in a management position.
He's the chief executive.
Yeah, he's the chief executive. Yeah. He's a publisher. And then he had recommended Robert Winnett to come over from the Telegraph in the UK over to the Washington Post as his executive editor. But today it has emerged that isn't happening now, and that person is staying in position at the Telegraph. But this is following some investigations by the Washington Post, which they printed on their front page, raising questions about Will Lewis and his role when he was part of the Murdoch empire in allegations of covering up the phone hacking scandal. He denies those allegations. And then this second figure as well that he wants to bring over. And basically, the journalists in the Washington Post, which of course is the newspaper of Woodward and Bernstein, yeah. The Watergate scandal, that we don't want these people. I mean, these journalists are potentially involved in criminality. They're involved, their names are coming up in court cases. What on earth? Why would we want these people in our newsrooms? And so it's I think it really is.
But they can just say we don't like it.
But we're going to investigate it, and we're going to publish stories in our own newspaper about this.
About their incoming executive editor.
It's a really seminal moment. There's no question that would happen here because they're just it just wouldn't. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity for us here in the UK it holds a mirror up. I don't think anyone's going to look in the mirror, but it holds a mirror up and says, you people in the UK, and Brian Cathcart made this point in a piece today. If anything, literally thousands of journalists, according to Brian Cathcart, all across the UK, who through their omission or their actions are just sort of working to cover up these sorts of things rather than illuminate them. And it's really obvious to the people at the Washington Post that having people in editorial positions or management positions who have such allegations against them isn't a good thing. So they can see it immediately. And I think it really holds a mirror up. And I think it does go, I know American journalism has also had its challenges in the Trump years, but I do think in terms of their printed press, the standard of investigative journalism in America is it pales in comparison to what we have here.
So we will be talking to Jay Rosen a bit at the festival about the limitations of this kind of high-minded view from nowhere. But, when I raised that question, can you imagine the Sunday Times printing investigation into the wrongdoings of any of its staff? No. Can you imagine the BBC actually getting out a documentary while still alive, a documentary on Savile and his wrongdoing? No. This is exactly what the Washington Post has done. It has exposed many questions about its overall CEO, Will Lewis, and his incoming chief executive editor, and put them on the front page. These are highly sourced factual stories, drawing a lot of the work we did at Byline Investigates with John Ford, the blagger involved, who worked allegedly with Winnett and Lewis when they were both at the Telegraph and the Sunday Times. And it does make me think, Hardeep, this goes back to the Daniel Morgan murder. Can I just say the Daniel Morgan murder, a famous, infamous axe slaying, a private detective, murder death in a car park, 5 investigations, most investigated murder in British history. Nothing happens because it involves a corrupt policing and the press. And yet, when the 2 suspects had got off, I think the second time in the early 90s, what did the Fleet Street do? These guys have been arrested twice on suspicion of an axe murder of their business partner. What should we do? Let's recruit them. Let's use them. And they're used extensively by Piers Morgan and the editor, now editor the Express. And of course, that's Gary Jones. And of course, by News of the World and other newspapers. A qualification to be a journalist, a senior journalist, is your ability to cover up, to hide the truth. And look, without naming names, I've seen the treatment of media figures in certain radio stations, who lose their jobs. And then the role of the other presenters is it's all to, that's the sign of a good editor, a good journalist, that you can cover things up rather than illuminate. It's kind of an inverse world where the higher up you've gone, the more likely you got there, like the editor of the Express, like Piers Morgan, like Rebecca Brooks, and now it appears like Will Lewis, because you know where the bodies are buried.
I mean, Andy Coulson as well was the number 10 chief of communications under David Cameron. He was convicted during the phone hacking trial. And then David Cameron said that was a bad decision. I want to give him one more chance, and bringing him back into government was a bad decision. It's just, so these examples are peppered everywhere. And I think, again, it's that very closed world between people who are in newsrooms as journalists and editors and politicians colluding in sort of covering up scandals that are not in their interest to bring into the public eye. And the Washington Post is never the newspaper that exposed Watergate is not going to have that. And I always, this is the thought experiment I always do. Can you imagine if Woodward and Bernstein had started to piece together the picture on Watergate, and then instead of publishing the stories as they actually did, started talking to people in the Republican in the Republican Party around Nixon and sort of doing some deals and saying, well, we won't reveal that. If you can't imagine it. And that, and that is exactly, unfortunately, what is happening too often in the newsrooms in Britain. And one look at it across the Atlantic, and they don't want anything to do with that.
I do think it's part of a sort of broader culture of impunity at the top, which goes, it's not just the media, it's politics as well. So you're seeing what's happening with Donald Trump at the moment, over the court cases. He was actually convicted of multiple counts. I just find it very hard to see anything similar happening ever in this. I mean, the most that's ever happened in this country is that a couple of senior politicians got £50 fine and a slap on the wrist. You cannot imagine. I mean, where have there been the convictions under the PPE scandal, for instance, and investigations? There was just this culture of impunity at the top, and I'd be interested to sort of flesh out why we think that is. That
I mean, it does go back, and I did write about it, I think, in the previous edition, is that, unfortunately, the British justice system, we always talk about money meaning a lot in America, right? But they have a very strong sense of the law. In the phone hacking trial, what you saw was, I think it cost the state, the full investigation and the trial, £15 million, right? Murdoch spent £60 million on it. With the defense, they had... I remember when Rebecca Brooks was arrested, she was arrested, searched in her Chelsea apartment, and there's this famous thing, her partner had left this laptop and some porn somewhere. Anyway, funny at the time, but actually what it disguised was there were about 6 police officers the rest. There were 12 private security watching the police officers. And I think that set the benchmark. It's very interesting. Will Lewis was obviously quite close to Boris Johnson because he was part of this group advising him. He was at the Telegraph when Boris Johnson was getting this chicken feed of £250,000. So, but it's almost like a Mexican standoff to me, don't you think? I mean, there's one thing before we go on to Farage, we must then talk to him if we have to briefly. There was an amazing moment in the trial where a tape was played of Andy Coulson going up to see David Blunkett, who I think was Home Secretary at that time, right? And basically telling him, we know you've got this love child because we've hacked you, right? We've hacked you to bits and we're going to run this story. And it was really, and Blunkett's not a quiet, wallflower. It's a very strong personality, very dominant personality. And it was basically that Coulson was the boss. He had this tape, well, we're going to run this. And, it was like, that the real power didn't live with the Home Secretary, but the then editor, I think maybe deputy editor of the News of the World. And so these relationships, this is why I think it's very interesting. I'll get to Farage in a moment, because they are based on intimidation as much as coziness.
I mean, there's all that. And then, as Adam says, what is it about the impunity? And so we take the last 14 years. I do think this is about the class of people who are not just in politics as a whole, but end up right at the top. And the elite nature of that, not only in that sort of those, when you get to that position, what you're tasked to do is quite elite, but also in particular in these past few years, the people who have ended up there, what background do they come from? What class do they come from? And how does that empower them to act and behave in ways that they're not even conscious of? It's just the water they swim in. Because I think if somebody gave me a job in the cabinet, or my first thought would never be, well, I can just start betting on things and get away with stuff and lie, and I just cannot imagine. And that's not, or you wouldn't be able to imagine it. Loads of people wouldn't be able to, how do you get that mindset of as to who you are as an individual, where you do just feel empowered and assured and confident. And I do think it is to do with the class that these people come from. Not to make sweeping generalizations, but in life, if you have, done quite well and been rewarded by this, apparent meritocracy that we live in, that you do get a sense of this is for, I'm born to do this sort of role. I know how to do it. And that,
Boris
and
Johnson,
you just become used to it.
He believed from an early age he was due to be world king. It's a kind of born to rule kind of attitude.
So there's also arrogance and egotism. One interesting side effect of that, though, I'll just pass this before we quickly move on to Farage as a closing thought. It also leads to insularity and idiocy, doesn't it? I'm thinking particularly of Rishi Sunak's best man, who was the political editor of The Spectator, who's part of this decision to go early. They thought they were doing something very, very clever, James Forsyth, whose partner is also another journalist.
Who resigned over Partygate.
Over Partygate and making jokes about breaking lockdown, Allegra Stratton, that it does lead to a bubble effect. And because you're so self-assured, you can be in this bubble and then it goes pop. Maybe that's what we're seeing with the polls.
I guess because we're such
Yeah.
a small country and Westminster is such a small world, it's kind of magnified even to a greater extent here than it would be in other countries.
Yeah, where you have the huge, like, there's Washington Post and the New York Times, and there's the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe. There's many other big papers. So it's just...
But it is going pop.
Yeah.
I think just briefly coming back to these debates last night, I agree with Adam. Rishi Sunak looked very tired. I really think that he is just trying to get through the next 2 weeks. I think he's given up. I think you can see it in his face.
When was the last big intervention that he made? Really? Where was the big policy announcement?
It was civil, it was national services, last one I remember.
It was it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, wasn't it? I mean,
Yeah, there's no policy.
He's just been firefighting, really, on these
I
scandals.
mean, we heard a lot about Sleepy Keir. I mean, it's been Sleepy Rishi over the last couple of weeks. I haven't seen him at all.
So it's so great to spend nearly 50 minutes and not talk about Nigel Farage. Isn't that great? Hey, we briefly mentioned Reform UK, previously known as ReFuck. So I just to close on that. I mean, there is a big piece I've done on the 5 questions about, as I mentioned before, we should ask Nigel Farage about Trump, Brexit, and Russia. But he criticised the party a lot, didn't he? About it, said, the Conservatives are taking the family silver. This is, by the way, another city trader. He went to private school, Nigel Farage.
Commodities trader he was.
Commodities trader, the man of the people with his multi-millionaire party and billionaire backers. What it seems to be doing, interesting with the press and with the voters, is splitting the right. It doesn't seem to be it just seems to be making things worse for the Tories. So I missed something. Some people are talking about their second to Labour and he'll be leading the opposition. Because of the electoral map, it's not going to happen, is it?
Well, I think in terms of the election, it's not having much impact on Labour. And it's certainly splitting the Conservative vote and turning a very bad result into potentially a sort of disastrous result for the Conservative Party. We'll see what happens, because there is a wide range of results and there is a world in which Reform actually do break through and get a lot more seats. I think what's more interesting is what happens after the general election. Does Nigel Farage, either as leader of Reform or as a member of a new Farageist Conservative Party, then become a sort of new opposition movement against Labour, centre-ground Labour government?
But with very few, just electorally, let's be clear, with very few seats. I mean,
unless he's absorbed into the Conservative Party by a new leader or whatever.
But that Conservative Party will have to be into double figures, not to triple figures, for that to happen when it needs to be.
Which I think they are likely to be. I mean, there's a big range, and some of that range has them down as low as 30 seats, but I think the upper range is as high as sort of 140 seats or something like that. So we'll have to wait and see on that, I think.
But they still could be smaller than the Lib Dems. Any thoughts on that? The fact we haven't talked that much about Nigel Farage? Are you relieved, Hardeep? Do you feel a huge reform insurgency, or do you think it's been a bit talked up?
I think he is still a concerning figure. I mean, in recent days, a few stories have emerged about his apparent support for Andrew Tate.
Oh, that's very
who's a very concerning
Andrew
figure.
Tate, who is accused of people trafficking and rape, is in Romania about to be prosecuted, and his brother, and he's a very big figure on the sort of masculinity and sort of misogyny, you would say.
Yeah, and I think, just tapping into these streams that he is part of, and sort of what, if he does gain prominence, if he does gain this seat in Clacton, which one poll funded by his friend Aaron Banks seemed to suggest that he will gain that seat, he's going to have another degree of prominence. I mean, that's what's interesting, because at the moment he has a lot of prominence. He has a lot of platforms in the media and political life, but actually doesn't have a public role. I mean, he was an MEP, but he's never been an MP. So can you, I guess in a way, can you imagine? I'm just thinking about it right now. Can you imagine if he wins the seat, how much prominence he will get? And I really do think that. And then it does become,
he's the leader of his opposition.
Well, he's oppositional, and now he has an official platform as opposed to the unofficial platform he's always been given anyway. And so, it is concerning. So, what is he going to use that platform for beyond the sort of current themes we know? There does seem to be one eye still that he has on this sort of almost American, they called it alt-right sort of whole world of, masculinity, misogyny, patriarchy, that sort of thing, which seemed very much the MAGA movement in Republicans in America.
What he claims, what Reform claim, is that they do have a growing audience among young men, and particularly on TikTok and other social media outlets. So it'd be, there's not huge amounts of sort of real world evidence of that, but it'd be interesting. There is certainly the case that there are young men who are sort of leaning to the right in a way that previous generations didn't. So it'd be interesting if either Nigel Farage or a sort of broader Farageist movement is able to tap into that over the coming years.
We've seen it. Otto English is probably going to write for us. He's seen it with his sons at that age and among friends that influence. But these are not an electoral force. It's back to the culture wars, isn't it? Everything Nigel Farage said, his budget of reform, it's just the culture war memes. It's immigration. It's not actually policy.
But the one thing I'd say, he's much more effective at pursuing those culture wars than Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party have been. And I think he's, although it's kind of easy to mock him, and I've done that myself many times. I think he's actually a lot smarter than that. And I think that how he's pitched himself in this election has been quite clever. To come out from the start and say Labour have won this election, that was a very smart move. And to turn all of his guns against the Conservative Party, and actually repeatedly praise Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner and others in the Labour Party. So whereas what we've seen from the Conservative Party, I think, is sort of a ham-fisted attempt at launching the culture wars, which has just backfired on them
and they don't really attack him, do they? It's funny. They feel like they have to emulate him rather than attack him.
Well, they've sort of started a bit this week to the Conservative Party to attack Farage, but not in any significant way. But certainly at recent debates when they appeared alongside it, it's really been sort of kid gloves treatment towards Nigel Farage.
It's interesting what you're saying, Adam, because obviously we've had a party in government that has tried the culture wars. And in a sense, if that party loses the next election and is out of power, then those culture wars go with them. But I think you're saying something which is really important, that actually the real culture wars that could actually have some salience with some people, much more than the ones that we've seen, they may actually be much more prominent in our political life.
And much easier to pursue from opposition than from government.
Yeah.
It's very hard to pursue these culture wars when you can't get it's very hard to listen to a Conservative politician talk about
immigration,
when they've been in charge over the last 14 years, and when people can't get an NHS appointment. When you've got someone like Nigel Farage, who actually put out quite a sort of objectively quite a powerful video today, where he's just sitting on a bench with his dog in the country, sort of. And he's essentially saying nothing works in the country, and that's a really powerful message that goes across the political. And you can imagine people who wouldn't ordinarily agree with his politics or even like him as an individual. That's quite a powerful message, and it's a message that really Labour Party hasn't pursued in the same way or as effectively, I think, in this campaign.
It's the change message, isn't it? It's the Trump change when he attacked the Republicans. So. Well, we wait and see. Well, we shall be keeping an eye on that in the next week. Thank you, Hardeep. Thank you, Adam, for joining us in our election Votewatch24 week 4. We have 2 more weeks to go. What will the next scandal be? Well, the bets are off on that one. And we'll be coming back next week. And then the week after that, we'll be live from the Byline Festival with our election coverage, with Adam and Hardeep, Josiah Mortimer, our chief correspondent, figures like Peter Oborn, Alex Hall, I can't even remember, Sangeeta Miska. We're all going to, and it's going to be led also by our podcast presenter, Adrian Goldberg. We'll be broadcasting live on the night of the election and the morning afterwards. Meanwhile, we'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in and listening in. If you're listening to this again on podcast, you can't see it. If you're on podcast, here's in the shop the latest edition of Byline Times. You can get it in most good supermarkets. In the middle is a game of Snakes and Leaders, a brilliant board game you can play on election night, illustrated and devised by Martin Rosen. You can get your copy in the shops or go to bylinetimes.com and subscribe. Meanwhile, thanks for listening, and see you on the next stage of the roller coaster next week. Crazy Election Campaign Game in stores now.